Manipulation rarely begins with lies. It begins with small moments you barely notice. The moment you become afraid to disappoint someone. The moment you feel guilty for saying no. The moment you start explaining yourself to people who have no intention of understanding you. Most people believe manipulation is something that happens to the weak. The truth is, it happens to anyone who doesn't understand how their own emotions can be used against them. And that distinction matters more than most people ever stop to consider. Think about this. The people who manipulate most effectively are rarely the ones who force anything. They don't need to. What they do instead is locate the specific emotional pressure points you've been carrying for years. Your fear of rejection, your need to be understood, your discomfort with conflict, your desire to be seen as good, and they apply weight there precisely and wait. The door opens on its own. This is the part almost everyone misses. Manipulation doesn't override your will. It borrows it. It works through your own emotional responses, using them like a key you handed over without realizing you held one. Machiavelli understood this about power long before modern psychology had the language to name it. The most dangerous thing you can be, in any environment, is predictable. Not predictable in the sense of being reliable or consistent. Those are qualities worth having. Predictable in the sense that your emotional reactions follow a pattern anyone patient enough to observe can learn to trigger. When someone knows that a particular word will make you defensive, that a particular tone will make you compliant, that a particular kind of praise will make you agree to things you'd otherwise question, they don't need leverage over you. You've already provided it. Most people never notice the moment this begins. At first it seems harmless. Someone in your life, a friend, a partner, a family member, a colleague, starts learning your patterns. How you respond when someone cries. How quickly you soften when someone seems disappointed in you. How reliably you fill silence with explanation when the other person simply waits. None of this is sinister in isolation. But here's where it becomes dangerous. Once someone maps your emotional architecture without you mapping your own, the power in that relationship quietly shifts. They know where you'll move before you do. And you, feeling the vague sensation of always somehow giving more than you intended, chalk it up to personality or circumstance rather than recognizing it as a structural problem you can actually solve. The uncomfortable truth is that emotional dependency is the root of most manipulation. Not stupidity, not weakness, dependency. The moment your sense of self requires someone else's approval to feel stable, that person holds something over you whether they intend to use it or not. This is why a romantic partner who says exactly the right words at exactly the right moment can rewrite a conversation you'd already made peace with. It's why a parent's disappointment can collapse a decision you spent weeks arriving at. It's why a manager's casual praise can make you work twice as hard on things that serve them rather than you. You weren't tricked by brilliant strategy. You were reached through a dependency you hadn't yet examined. Pay close attention to what approval-seeking does to your decision-making in practice. Think about the last time you agreed to something you didn't want to do, not because you were forced, but because the discomfort of refusing felt larger than the cost of complying. You may have called it being helpful. You may have called it keeping the peace, but look at it more directly. You made a decision based on how the other person would feel rather than what the situation actually called for. That is not generosity. Generosity requires choice. What happened instead was that someone else's emotion sat in the driver's seat of a decision that belonged to you, and you let it, because you hadn't yet learned to distinguish between caring about someone and being controlled by your fear of their reaction. This is the part almost everyone misses about guilt. Guilt in its genuine form is a useful signal. It tells you that your actions have violated your own values, and it prompts correction. But the guilt most people carry daily isn't that kind. It's the guilt that arrives when you simply fail to meet someone else's expectations, when you cancel plans you never wanted to make, when you don't explain yourself quickly enough, when you prioritize your own time over someone's request. That guilt is not a signal from your values. It's a signal from a pattern you were taught, that other people's comfort is your responsibility. And once you carry that belief, even unconsciously, the people around you don't need to ask you directly for anything. They only need to appear hurt or disappointed or distant, and you will adjust yourself to fix a problem you didn't create. Think about how this plays out in a friendship. Someone in your circle makes a habit of involving you in their problems, always urgently, always as though your absence would constitute a kind of betrayal. Over time, the texture of the relationship starts to feel less like genuine connection and more like obligation. You feel guilty not responding. You feel guilty setting limits on your availability. You feel guilty having your own needs in a conversation that always seems to orbit theirs. And the uncomfortable truth is that this dynamic rarely arrives through cruelty. It arrives through need, which makes it harder to name and much harder to interrupt. Most people would rather exhaust themselves than feel like they've abandoned someone who needed them, which is precisely why it works. Now consider what happens when you stop explaining yourself. Not out of aggression, not to punish anyone, but simply because you've recognized that explanation is often what the pressure is designed to extract. A person who manipulates through guilt doesn't need you to comply immediately. They need you to feel responsible for the discomfort your refusal causes them. And the moment you begin explaining, listing your reasons, apologizing for your position, softening the boundary until it no longer resembles one, you've entered the negotiation they were waiting for. Here's why that matters. A genuine boundary doesn't require your justification to be valid. It stands because you've decided it stands. The moment you start negotiating with someone's reaction to it, you've quietly communicated that the boundary is provisional, conditional, available to be moved if they apply enough pressure or enough pain. This changes everything about how you understand the conversations you've been having. The colleague who responds to your no with visible frustration and then waits silently to see what you'll offer in its place. The partner who becomes cold and distant after a disagreement until you're the one who comes back to smooth it over, regardless of who was right. The family member who brings up sacrifice every time you try to make a decision that serves only yourself. These are not accidents of personality. They are learned strategies, whether consciously deployed or not, that have worked on you before and will work again unless the pattern underneath them changes. The pattern isn't in them, it's in you. This is the part almost everyone misses when they try to protect themselves from manipulation. They focus outward. They try to identify who the manipulators are, who to avoid, who to trust. And while observing behavior is important, Machiavelli was correct that people's actions reveal far more than their words ever will. The more decisive shift is inward. Because the truth is, the same person who manipulates you effortlessly in one relationship has no power over someone else in an identical situation. The difference is not the manipulator. It's the degree to which the other person understands and has resolved their own emotional needs. Here's where it becomes dangerous to misread this. Understanding your emotional patterns is not the same as becoming cold. Becoming difficult to manipulate doesn't require you to stop caring about people, stop being generous, or treat every relationship as a strategic calculation. It requires something more specific. It requires knowing the difference between choosing to give and feeling compelled to give. Because generosity chosen freely costs you something but leaves you whole. Generosity extracted through pressure costs you the same thing but quietly erodes the sense that you control your own life. Over time, a person who gives only because they're afraid of the consequences of not giving becomes less and less recognizable to themselves. They begin to confuse their own preferences with other people's needs, their own voice with the expectations layered over it. Most people never notice how predictable their emotional triggers make them, until someone uses those triggers at the worst possible time. Think about the person at work who knows that public praise from leadership makes you lower your guard, agree faster, and question your own reservations. Think about the friend who knows that if they accuse you of being selfish, you'll immediately defend yourself by proving you're not, usually by giving them exactly what they asked for in the first place. Think about the partner who knows that if they become distant after a conflict, your anxiety about abandonment will bring you back to the table before any real resolution has occurred. None of these people necessarily planned this consciously. What they did was observe you repeatedly until your responses became familiar enough to rely on. And because you never observed yourself with the same attention, you couldn't see what they were working with. Pay close attention to the role that emotional reactivity plays in all of this. A reactive person is not simply someone with strong feelings. A reactive person is someone who has not yet built the gap between stimulus and response that gives them any real choice about what happens next. When someone says something provocative, the reactive person responds immediately, often defensively, often by saying or doing things that escalate the very situation they wanted to resolve. This matters because manipulation often depends on that reactivity. The provocative comment is not always accidental. It is sometimes designed to move you from the calm position you were holding into one that's easier to steer. The moment you become defensive, emotional, or desperate to be understood, you've moved out of a position of clarity and into one of need. And need, as we've established, is where influence enters. The alternative is not suppression. Suppressing emotion is not the same as disciplining it. A suppressed emotion simply delays its expression, and when it finally surfaces, it arrives with interest, often at the worst possible moment. What the most psychologically resilient people develop instead is the ability to feel the emotion fully while not immediately acting from it. They can register the discomfort of disappointing someone and sit with it. They can feel the pull of someone's sadness without automatically absorbing responsibility for it. They can feel the sting of criticism without immediately defending themselves or collapsing under it. That window between feeling something and acting on it is where actual power lives. Silence plays a specific role in this. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with conversational silence, so they fill it, often confessing, over-explaining, or softening a position that needed no softening. A skilled manipulator knows this and simply waits. The discomfort does the work for them. You break your own position before they have to say a single word. Learning to hold silence, to let a pause be a pause rather than a vacuum you must immediately fill, is one of the most underestimated psychological tools available to you. It communicates something that no amount of explanation ever manages to, that you are not made anxious by other people's reactions to your choices. Social media simply made all of this faster and more concentrated. The same dynamics that play out in a relationship or a family dinner now play out at scale, with the added variable that almost everyone can see exactly how many people approved of you in numbers, in real time. Comparison becomes constant and involuntary. Someone posts a life that looks like the one you wanted, and for a moment, before you've even registered the thought, you feel the familiar pressure of not being enough yet. You didn't consent to that pressure. You didn't invite it in. It arrived through the same emotional architecture that manipulation has always used, the gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. That gap is not a flaw. Every person carries it. But a person who hasn't examined their own version of it becomes available to anyone who knows how to widen it: a brand, an algorithm, an insecure partner, a competitive colleague. The widening always begins the same way, not with force, but with the quiet suggestion that you need something you don't yet have to be acceptable. This is why observing behavior rather than listening to words is not cynicism. It is the most basic form of accurate perception available to you. Words are chosen for their effect. Behavior, especially over time and especially under pressure, reveals what words are designed to conceal. The person who tells you they respect your boundaries while consistently testing them is telling you something. The colleague who praises your work publicly while undermining it privately is showing you something. The partner who apologizes fluently after every difficult episode, but changes nothing is demonstrating something. Machiavelli understood that people reveal themselves through action far more honestly than through declaration, and that the failure to observe this, the choice to believe what's said rather than see what's done, is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make in any relationship of consequence. The most psychologically protected person in any room is rarely the most suspicious one. They are the most observant one. The relationship between self-respect and freedom from manipulation is direct and unavoidable. You cannot be manipulated through fear of rejection if you have truly accepted that some people will reject you, and that your value is not determined by their willingness to stay. You cannot be manipulated through guilt if you have clarified what your actual obligations are, as opposed to the obligations others have assigned you. You cannot be manipulated through approval if you have built a stable enough relationship with your own judgment that praise feels pleasant but not necessary. This is not a cold or defensive posture. It is the most honest form of psychological freedom available, the kind where your behavior flows from your actual values rather than from the shifting weather of other people's moods. Here's why that matters in practical terms. When you no longer need someone's approval to feel grounded, you stop needing to earn it, and you stop behaving in ways designed to secure it. You become less available to pressure, less reactive to disapproval, less willing to compromise things that matter simply to smooth a moment that will pass anyway. People around you may initially be unsettled by this. Some will try harder to find the lever that still works, but here's what most people never anticipate. Once the pattern of giving in to pressure is genuinely broken, the attempts at pressure stop over time because they stop working. The dynamic doesn't just feel different, it actually changes. At first, this seems like a small shift. Over time, it becomes fundamental, because what you're really building is not a defense against a particular person or a specific situation. You're building a consistent relationship with your own interior, one where you know what you value, you know what you'll protect, you know what you'll offer freely and what you won't be moved from, and you know the difference between those categories clearly enough that no one can blur the lines from the outside. In The Prince, Machiavelli made the point that it's far better for a ruler to be genuinely feared than merely loved, because love is conditional and can be withdrawn. But the deeper truth, which the most psychologically independent people understand, is that neither fear nor love should anchor your decisions when they come from outside yourself. The only relationship stable enough to build from is the one you have with your own clarity. The people who are hardest to manipulate are not the coldest, the loudest, or the most intimidating in the room. They are the ones who understand themselves so deeply that guilt cannot steer them, fear cannot rush them, praise cannot blind them, and pressure cannot redefine them. They don't control everyone around them. They simply refuse to surrender control of themselves. Their boundaries don't require explanation because they emerge from self-knowledge rather than performance. Their calm doesn't require reinforcement because it was built in private, not granted by consensus. They can be generous because they choose to be, not because they were cornered into it. They can walk away from dynamics that cost them more than they return, without apology and without theater. And in a world where most people react without thinking, where most emotional decisions are made before they've even been examined, where guilt and approval and fear and obligation move through social environments like invisible architecture, that quiet mastery becomes one of the rarest and most durable forms of power a person can hold. Not power over others, power over the one thing that actually belongs to you, yourself. The question worth sitting with long after this video ends is simple. How well do you actually know your own patterns, and who else already knows them better than you do?